Hi, Roger McGool is here at O'Reilly's AI 2019 conference in San Jose, and I'm here with Dinesh Nirmal. He's a VP of Data and AI Development at IBM. Welcome.
Thank you, Roger.
And AI is a big area. It's complex.
Right.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
What's the first bit of advice you would give someone who's thinking about the space?
Right. I think the first bit of advice I would give, if you're especially an enterprise, identify a use case. I mean, what are you trying to do, and does it really need AI? That's the first thing I would do. The second piece is that, Roger, I really don't think there's a shortage of data. There's plenty of data, whether it's social data, behavioral data, transactional data. I don't think there's a shortage of data, but getting clean data to make sure that, because the training data set becomes such a critical piece of how the model is going to behave and how accurate it is. So the advice I would give is identify a use case and make sure AI is critical or AI is necessary for that use case. Sometimes you could use rules engine to build what you want to or accomplish what you want, or it could be even a BI use case in some cases, right? So you don't need to go to the AI element of building multiple neural nets and all those things. Let's just keep it simple. And the second is data. I mean, make sure that you have the right set of data, not a lot of data.
So that's a good segue into, how do you help organizations grapple with the complexities if AI is the right choice with the pipeline, with the data prep and deploying, which is going to take more time than the model probably.
Oh yeah. I think so. When I look at AI, I call it the 3 Ds. There is obviously the middle D is the development of the model. The first one is the data, right? And the last one is the deployment. I think most enterprises get tripped over the first and the last D, which is, how do I discover the data? How do I profile the data? How do I classify the data? The quality of the data, the provenance of the data, the whole data governance piece. And the last is the deployment, because it's not just about building the model. How do you deploy it into your existing infrastructure that's 30, 40, 50 years old, and then productionize it, right? The development of the model itself is getting more and more commoditized in a way that you have a lot of, you feed the data, it churns out a bunch of models based on the algorithms. That's getting more and more automated, but the last 2 Ds are critical. So to answer your question, I would say where I start is that, do we have a clean data set to start with? How is the data quality? That's where I start with, because data becomes so critical, because that training data set, past data is what will really elevate the quality of the model. So we got to make sure we get the data right. So that's where I usually start with customers, is that let's look and first identify the use case, then let's look at the data and make sure that we can get the right data for you to train the model.
So during this discussion, it's clear that you've got some empirical experience with all this.
Sure.
How do you do internally? What are you using AI for? And
right. So I run a large development organization, and we obviously in IBM we use AI in HR, for example, helping with the compensation. We use AI within customer service. We use AI within hiring, right? So AI is being used widely, but for me personally, I will give you a really good example where we have 3,000 plus developers, and obviously a lot of customers, enterprise customers, where when a problem happens, it's always severity 1. Regardless of it is, they want to get it fixed, because for them it doesn't matter whether we had 1,000 plus PMRs, their PMR or their problem ticket becomes the most critical. And developers obviously get so many problems a day, they cannot go after everyone, because every problem is coming in as one. So we used AI within our mechanism to say, how do we really find out if this problem is critical? Will it get escalated? So we used a bunch of features based on how many days it has been open, which component of the code is it hitting, the history and trend of the customer. So we used a bunch of features to predict, yes, this problem is one, routed to this developer. And Roger, believe it or not, we had 40% improvement in our NPS, because we were able to really channel our problems to the right person who could get it fixed and Then we also used AI once they coded a fix to say, we don't need to run all 1,000 regression test cases. This code only changed this particular piece of the software. Let's just run regression for that particular piece of the code. So it efficiently elevated us to improve our NPS and the customer side. So when you ask, I mean, there's so many places where you can AI, but that's where you have to look at the use case and say, how do we make sure that this particular use case will help us improve the customer experience, and also, developers becomes much more efficient.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, just because I have an interest in text analysis, looking at trouble tickets, did it include any text?
No, it did not. I mean, so what we did was that, so a lot of the data comes from, so after the problem is fixed, obviously we look at the NPS, Medallia comes in, we look at the text, Watson has some speech to text and, text to speech. So we started converting it, doing sentimental analysis, all those things. But prior to that, we didn't have to use text analytics. It was purely based on some of the features that we created, based on customer input, based on the number of days the PMR has been open, which part of the code it hit. I mean, for example, in the database side, if it's hitting buffer pool or if it's hitting data manager side, obviously the criticalities tend to be higher rather than it hitting log manager, which is less severe. So we kind of categorized it, pattern analysis, all those things. So that's where we focused on.
Great. So a theme of this conference, I would say, and just that doesn't, a lay person who just reads the paper knows that trust, fairness,
Right.
bias are all really a big part of the AI story, and in some ways might be the Achilles heel of what
Right.
what we're able to do. In fact, I think some of these things are becoming an imperative, not just a nice to have. So IBM seems to be clearly working on some of these things. Maybe you can describe some of those efforts.
Right, definitely. So I think once you build a model, right, I think everybody thinks the job is done once you get a level of accuracy. But then comes the real work. For example, is the model explainable? Once you deny a loan, can you explain to the regulator that why that loan was denied? Is the model fair? I mean, is it biased? I mean, is it not giving to particular genders, race, age group? So you have to make sure of that accuracy. Is the model drifting? Has the data changed? And then, the last but not least, I talk about open. I mean, to me, I honestly believe, Roger, this cannot be a paradigm where a couple of vendors or enterprises have secret sauce or a bunch of algorithms that they hold close to their chest. This has to be done in the open. This has to be a movement, because I strongly believe that AI is the biggest undertaking we have in our lifetime and in many generations to come. And unless these models are trained to be fair, ethical, and accurate and explainable, I think we'll have much more problems down the road. So IBM is taking huge steps. I mean, we contributed immensely back into the community. We are working very closely with the community to make sure that, how do we make a bias detection system? How do we make sure it's fair? How do we make sure it's explainable? All those things. We have a software called Watson OpenScale that's available, which is built on open source, which we have contributed back into open source. But to me, that's probably the most important piece, is that it's a movement, and it has to come from the community, not from a vendor, not from an enterprise, or not from a single source. It has to come from a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So I've heard IBM say that you can't have AI without IA, information architecture. Maybe you can quickly explain that.
Right. So that goes from the 3 Ds I talked about. Being able to take the data or discover the data, right? I mean, where is your data? Being able to profile the data, being able to classify the data, being able to cleanse the data. I mean, there's a whole data process, but then you also need governance around the data. I mean, how do we get the data to the data scientist in a much more faster fashion? I mean, today they say that it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get any data to the data scientist. How can you enable self-service analytics? So IA, or information architecture, not only enables that, but it puts the governance layer on top of it, not just the data, but the whole life cycle of AI, taking it from the data, being able to develop the model, being able to deploy the model. So that life cycle becomes the information architecture. So AI cannot be done without IA, partly because you want to make sure the flow of data and the models to the deployment of the model is under some level of governance. And for enterprises, it becomes huge because there's whole kind of regulatory, implications to it. I'll give you an example. I've been working with a large bank in Europe where, they said right now they have models built on SAS. To take those models and even convert to Python, conversion is not a problem, but to get that model regulatory approved is 18 to 24 months. That's one model. So that's the real world challenge that these customers are facing. It's not like, I'm a data scientist, I got some data, I coded a model, I deployed it, done. That's not the case.
Right, so we have to have AI for the real world.
Right. I mean, and that's what we have to, and it's really interesting that how prevalent it becomes. This morning there was a news by Airbus where they call it the connected airplane, where they can even tell you when you get up from your seat, they can even tell how many times you use the lavatory, or how crowded it is, all those things. But the data, more and more data comes, I'm sure they're going to be able to predict, in future. What might take to Airbus also, first you have to make sure that lavatory works before, you can send people there. But, they're using all this data to predict the future. So AI is becoming in our everyday life, and you cannot be successful in enterprise without IA.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.